Hello, and welcome back to An Idea Way. I'm Hayden, and today's episode is about coffee, but not really just coffee, because if you break it down, what Starbucks sells at the most basic level, it's almost embarrassingly simple. Coffee beans, milk, water, sugar, cups. There's a lot of different drinks and combinations of these things, yes, but fundamentally, Starbucks is selling something that people had already been making and drinking for hundreds of years before Starbucks even existed. Howard Schultz didn't invent coffee. He didn't invent the cafe. He didn't even originally found the company Starbucks. And yet, somehow, he helped turn a small Seattle coffee bean shop into one of the most recognizable companies on the planet. Which means the interesting question here isn't really how Starbucks made a better cup of coffee. The more interesting question that I found, and the one that I want to spend this whole question on, is how Starbucks made a cup of coffee mean something more than it used to. That's really the whole story behind Howard Schultz. It's about what happens when a business stops selling a product and starts selling an experience. And it's also, maybe more importantly than that, about what happens when a business becomes so successful that the experience starts disappearing underneath all the growth it created through the experience. Schultz tells a lot of his story in his book Onward, which mostly focuses on his return to Starbucks during one of the hardest periods in the company's history. But to actually understand the turnaround there, you have to go back to where Starbucks started, which is Schultz walking into the small coffee company called Starbucks in Seattle and seeing something that almost nobody else there was seeing. At the time, Starbucks wasn't anything close to the Starbucks we know now. They mostly sold roasted coffee beans and brewing equipment to people who wanted to make good coffee at home. It had been founded by three guys, Jerry Baldwin, Zev Siegel, and Jordan Bowker, who genuinely cared about high-quality coffee more as like an art or a craft rather than as a business. Schultz joined the company in the early 1980s and was completely fascinated by it. He liked the product. He liked how seriously the founders treated quality. But the idea that eventually changed everything didn't come from Starbucks itself. It came from his trip to Italy. Schultz spent time in Milan and started noticing espresso bars everywhere he went. And those espresso bars weren't just places where people grabbed coffee and left. They were social spaces. People stood at the counter and talked with their barista by name. They stopped in before work every single morning as a part of their routine. They met up with their friends there. They became regulars. The cafe had worked its way into the actual rhythm of people's daily lives. And what Schultz realized in watching this is that the value of a cafe wasn't really sitting inside the product of coffee itself. The coffee was just the reason for people to walk in the door. The experience was the reason to make people come back. That is what Starbucks is built on. Schultz wanted to bring some version of that Italian coffeehouse feeling to the United States. He didn't just want to sell beans out of a small store anymore. He wanted to serve drinks. He wanted people to stay a while. He wanted the store to feel like a place that existed between home and work, which eventually got the name of the third place. Home is the first place, work is the second. The coffee house becomes the third, somewhere you can meet someone or sit by yourself or read or think or just exist for a bit without needing any reason to stay there. That idea sounds completely obvious now, mostly because of Starbucks and thousands of cafes and things like that, which copied the model of the third space. But at the time, it really wasn't clear that Americans would adopt the habits that Schultz had built up, or rather picked up on, in Italy. People were used to drinking black coffee at home, black coffee at diners, or just at work. Espresso drinks were unfamiliar. The vocabulary was unfamiliar. The prices were high and a lot more than people were used to paying. The whole experience behind Starbucks required teaching an entire country a new ritual from scratch. And this is honestly one of the first things about Schultz that I find interesting. Something I kept coming back to while researching this episode. He didn't go around asking customers what they already wanted and then build that. He saw a behavior happening somewhere else entirely, in a different country, understood the actual feeling behind that behavior, and believed that people here could and would want to learn that same thing. There's a difference between serving a demand that already exists and creating a brand new expectation that didn't exist before you showed up. Customers couldn't have walked into that original Seattle store and asked for the Starbucks we know today because that Starbucks didn't have a name yet, not in their heads. They might have asked for better coffee. They almost certainly wouldn't have been able to describe the exact combination of a cafe in the music, the smell, the furniture, the language, the ritual of ordering that would eventually define the whole company and the whole coffee space in America in general. Schultz had to see the possibility of this before the average customer could even put words to it. I think this is at its core a part of what entrepreneurship really is. It's not always about inventing something that nobody's ever seen before. It's about noticing that a totally ordinary product can create a completely different kind of experience if you change the context around it. Coffee wasn't a new idea in America. The way Schultz wanted people to relate to coffee was. The original owners of Starbucks weren't immediately sold on his vision, by the way, which I think is a detail around this that's worth talking about for a second. They cared about beans and brewing equipment. Schultz was more on the side of wanting to build full cafes. So Schultz eventually left and started his own company, based much more directly on the Italian espresso bar model he wanted to bring to America. Later, he ended up acquiring Starbucks itself and then merging the company name with the coffeehouse concept that he had sort of built up as its own business separately. And from there, the company started expanding into what we see it as today. But what made the whole thing work wasn't any single detail of the Italian model. It was the combination of all of them at once. The coffee mattered, the stores mattered, the baristas mattered, the music mattered, the smell mattered. The exact way that the drink got handed across the counter mattered. Even the vocabulary mattered. Tall, grande, venti. These words separated the Starbucks experience from just ordering a regular small or large cup of coffee at a diner. The language might seem a little unnecessary or corny when you say it out loud, and it honestly kind of is, but it helps to build a small world around the product. They're not, when you're going into Starbucks, you're not just buying coffee anymore. You're learning how to participate in the larger collective of Starbucks. This is really what brands are doing at their strongest moments. They're creating rituals, and a ritual is a fundamentally different thing than a transaction. A transaction is a one-time thing that starts and ends with an exchange. You hand over money, the company hands over a product, and that's it. A ritual or a habit, as Schultz was building, has familiarity, repetition, identity, and emotion. You go to the same Starbucks every time. You order the same drink. You don't even think about it. You know your barista. You sit in the same spot every day. The experience becomes a part of the structure of your day. At that point, a different coffee shop down the street isn't necessarily an equal substitute for this anymore, even if the coffee there is better. The customer isn't really choosing between the two liquids in either place. They're choosing between two completely different experiences. And that's an enormous business advantage if you can build that up. It's also hard to hold on to because experiences are made out of a lot more variables than just a cup of coffee. The details get hard to control on every location as the company grows. When Starbucks was small, Schultz and the people around him could pay attention to almost everything personally. They could check out the stores, they could talk to employees, they'd notice if the music was bad or if the coffee was bad or if the store just didn't feel welcoming or something like that. But as Starbucks has expanded, that kind of personal attention is just not possible to maintain anymore. There's more stores, there's more managers, there's more products, there's more countries, there's more investors, there's more pressure to grow. The company has had to build standardized systems that let their thousands of locations all operate without Schultz personally walking through every door. And standardization is what made that growth possible in the first place, but it also created a real danger to the company, and one that I think is actually the heart of the whole story behind Starbucks. The company could end up reproducing the appearance of Starbucks without reproducing the feeling of it. A store can have the Starbucks logo, the Starbucks cups, the Starbucks menu, the Starbucks furniture, but feel empty inside from an experience perspective. And that's the problem sitting at the center of Onward, his book. Starbucks had become massively successful by the time that Schultz started worrying about this, but he began to believe that parts of the company were quietly losing the thing that had made all of the success in building experience in the company possible in the first place. The business kept growing. The brand of Starbucks is more famous, but something underneath all of those numbers wasn't working out the way it used to. And I think, honestly, this is one of the weirdest situations, or I guess most unexpected situations a company can find itself in. Because when a business is obviously failing, it's easy to think like, oh, I need to change something. Like, it's justifiable to have a big change. If your sales are down, if your customers are leaving, if your money is gone, everybody would agree that something has to be done. But when the numbers still look good, raising a concern about quality or identity or abstract things like that tends to sound emotional. I don't know how else to put it. Like you're trying to do something that's not necessary. People ask, why would you want to interrupt something that's clearly working, that's making money? And that's exactly why growth in this scenario can become dangerous, completely separate from the way that failure is. Growth is treated as proof that a system's working. More stores mean the strategy's working. More revenue, more money means the customers must be satisfied with the drinks. And sometimes all that's true, but growth can also hide the problem. A company like Starbucks can keep expanding for years after the original experience has already started getting weaker because the reputation built during the good years keeps pulling people through the door of the habit. The scoreboard, the numbers that each store gets keeps climbing while the foundation of the experience underneath is slowly withering away. Schultz became worried that Starbucks was getting commoditized, meaning it was becoming more interchangeable. Like every other option around it was the same instead of something specific and worth seeking out. Instead of feeling like a coffee house, some locations were starting to feel like efficient beverage factories. The company brought in automated espresso machines, which helped employees make drinks faster and more consistently, but some of those machines were not as good as like the original baristas, or some of those machines would block the line of sight between the barista and the customer. And all those things just kind of sound like small, immutable details that don't really matter in the bigger picture, but it's not. Like with the line of sight between the barista and the customer, the relationship across the counter of Starbucks had always been a key part of the experience that Schultz was trying to sell. The second the machine got into the way of that interaction, efficiency behind the counter went up while the connection between the customer and the barista went down. The company had also expanded its food offerings around the same time, which made complete business sense on paper. Customers wanted breakfast options, and food increased how much a customer would spend per visit. But the smell of heated breakfast sandwiches sometimes overpowered the smell of coffee inside the store. But the smell of coffee was part of the store's identity. Someone walked through the door and was supposed to feel that they'd entered a coffee house. If the strongest smell in the room was melted cheese and cooked eggs instead, the store would be producing more sales, but they would actually be losing the experience on an emotional level. And Starbucks was opening new stores at an insane pace during this stretch of failure of experience. The whole priority of the company was expansion. Find a location, open a store, hit the target amount of sales, and repeat, open a new store. But every single store was another place where the original experience of Starbucks would either get protected and grown or diluted. When expansion is the only thing that you measure within a company, the company starts treating every new opening of a store as proof of progress. And nobody inside that system really wants to be the one person slowing the entire process down. But Schultz was asking a much harder question underneath all of it. Was Starbucks actually growing in a way that was making the company less special? And I think that's a weird, or almost a difficult question to answer out loud, because there's no value on a evaluation sheet measuring specialness. You can measure money, you can measure transactions, you can measure store openings, you can measure labor costs, you can measure drink prep times. You can't measure the soul. That's really what it is. The soul of a coffee house with anything close to number-like precision, which means that the intangible parts of a of a business are easy to ignore. If something can't be placed neatly into the quarterly report, it starts to feel a little less real in a business sense than things that can. But customers don't need to experience the company as a financial system. They experience the whole thing at once. They don't separate the operational efficiency from the emotional feeling. They just walk in and know almost instinctually whether the store is worth visiting. Schultz had actually stepped away from leadership at Starbucks for a few years before all this came to head. And then in 2008, he came back as the CEO. The company was facing internal problems. At the same moment, the entire global economy was sliding into a financial crisis. Customers were becoming careful with their money, and the coffee purchases were like an easy thing to cut in the daily budget. Competition had also grown a lot. Starbucks had expanded into many areas and was so aggressive with this expansion that some stores were too close to each other, or some stores were in locations that didn't make sense and they didn't get much business. The stock of Starbucks was dropping, their stores were closing, employees were anxious about their jobs. Schultz returned to a business that was still massive, was still ripe in the mind of the consumer, was still worth a lot of money, but wasn't secure in the way that it used to be in the mind of the average coffee consumer. His actual challenge here wasn't actually just to cut costs, though. It was to make Starbucks feel like Starbucks again, which almost sounds circular when you hear the idea of making Starbucks again. But I think it's something important. A company can forget why people cared about it in the first place. The company can become so focused on managing a result, revenue, growth, that it can slowly lose contact with the actual cause underneath that result. Starbucks had reached the scale it had because people valued the experience behind Starbucks. Then the scale itself created enormous pressure to simplify everything, automate everything. Eventually, the very systems that had been built to reproduce the original magic of Starbucks started removing it instead. And I think this is a pattern that shows up everywhere, even outside of the coffee business, which, again, is something I kept noticing while putting this episode together. A restaurant becomes genuinely popular because the food is made with care. Then demand goes up. The menu expands to cover more ground. Ingredients get swapped for cheaper or faster alternatives. Preparation speeds up to keep pace with growing customers. New locations open across the city or across the country even. The company technically ends up serving way more people, but a much smaller percentage of them actually experience what made the original place worth expanding in the first place. A creator builds a real audience by making thoughtful, careful content. Then the audience grows, and there's a sudden pressure to post constantly because consistency performs well in almost every social media algorithm out there. The work becomes predictable because predictable content tends to do better numerically, view-wise. The system produces a lot more content while slowly draining out the curiosity and the actual insightful thought that made the original work interesting to consume to begin with. Even a sports team can fall into this trap of thinking. A strong culture forms around trust and a shared sense of purpose. Then success brings outside attention to the team, and people inside the team start chasing individual recognition under the spotlight instead. The team might keep winning their games for a stretch, but the culture underneath that caused that winning starts changing and deteriorating, which causes their eventual destruction. Well, I want to be clear here. Growth doesn't automatically destroy quality, but growth is really good at exposing whether quality was ever actually a real durable system within the company, or rather if it was just the personal attention of a few people who happened to be in the room early on. One of the most dramatic moments in the whole Starbucks turnaround was when Schultz made the decision to temporarily close thousands of stores all at once for training baristas. For several hours, employees across the entire country practiced pulling espresso shots properly and preparing drinks the correct way. Financially, this was a crazy expensive decision. Customers couldn't buy anything. The company gave up a bunch of money just to train these baristas that most customers would never see, like literally the events of training a barista happen. From the outside, you could probably look at that decision to train all the baristas and call it theatrical. And I think some part of it probably was, but it sent a very real message to everyone that Starbucks was taking quality seriously again. I think the thing worth noticing here, though, is that symbols only matter when they're actually connected to real action behind them. Schultz was telling employees, customers, investors that speed and short-term revenue weren't the only priorities anymore, that the craft behind the coffee still mattered. The drink wasn't just an item anymore. It was supposed to be the center of the whole business. I think this might be one of Schultz's strongest parts in the story, that sometimes leadership requires doing something that looks stupid, or maybe not stupid, but inefficient on the surface, and in order to protect the thing that creates the real long-term value for the company. Closing every single store for training was not efficient in any immediate sense of return on investment, but if Starbucks could actually no longer make its core product correctly, what was the company becoming more efficient at producing? There's a bigger lesson there. Efficiency isn't good on its own. Efficiency just means producing a result using less time, effort, or money than before. But before you can responsibly make anything more efficient, you have to decide whether the result itself is even worth optimizing in the first place. A company can become incredibly efficient at creating an experience that nobody likes. And this pertains to multiple things, as I said before. A student can become efficient at completing assignments without ever actually learning stuff from them. An athlete can become efficient at repeating a movement that's wrong form-wise. A podcast can become efficient at producing episodes that don't really say anything new. The question of what's actually worth making has to become prevalent in the mind of the maker before the making it more efficient takes place. For Starbucks, the answer to this question could never just be coffee, because coffee was available everywhere. The real answer was some combination of product quality, human connection, daily routine, and a sense of place, all working together at once. And that meant Schultz also had to think seriously about employees, not just customers. Starbucks calls its workers partners, partly because the company historically offered stock ownership and benefits to most of their employees, including part-time workers who normally wouldn't get anything like that. But Schultz genuinely believed that customer experience could never be separated from the employee experience underneath that. A barista who feels ignored or hates their job is going to have a really hard time making any warmth for the person standing in front of them. You can't really build a brand centered on human connection while treating the actual humans delivering that connection like they're a piece of machinery or a cog in the machine. I should say clearly that this doesn't mean that Starbucks has always treated all of their employees well. The company has faced real serious problems over their working conditions, their scheduling practices, their labor relations, and their gaps between their stated values and what some workers have actually experienced in store. That tension that between policy and what actually happens really matters, and I don't think it's fair to just push that under the rug. A company can't be judged only by the story their leadership chooses to tell about itself. It should also be judged by what the people actually living inside that system experience every day. Still, though, I think that Schultz's underlying idea here is worth taking seriously, even with that criticism in mind. The experience moves outward in a chain. Leadership shapes the employee environment. The employee environment shapes how customers get treated in the moment. And that interaction between the customer and the company shapes the brand. And the brand shapes whether the customer comes back at all. A lot of companies try to skip right to the very last step of that chain. They want customer loyalty without ever actually building the kind of environment that produces loyal customers in the first place. They run advertisement or posters about connection while designing jobs that leave employees with no real time to connect with anyone. They say the customer comes first while treating the people serving that customer as just another cost to minimize. Schultz seemed to understand, at least in theory, that a brand can't hide the conditions it was actually produced under. Eventually, the customer feels it, like emotionally, even if they can't explain why it feels that way. A rushed employee, it creates a rushed store. A confused employee creates a confused store. A cynical employee makes even the most tolerant customer not like the company. And that product ends up carrying the culture along with it, whether that was the intended plan or not. This is a part of why the Starbucks turnaround was not just a marketing campaign dressed up. Schultz had to actually simplify the business, close underperforming stores, cut costs, restrain employees, improve the actual coffee, reconsider how their stores were designed, update the tech, build a stronger loyalty program, remove distractions in the stores that had crept into the business model over years, and communicate a reason for the company to keep existing that went beyond just making more money every quarter. One of the hard parts of any turnaround like this is that leaders have to protect the future of the company while dealing with the immediate financial problems at the same time. It's easy to talk about or theorize about purpose when a company is growing comfortably, when they're making more money every quarter. Purpose gets a lot harder to talk about, honestly, when stores are closing and people are real people are losing their jobs. At that point, every theoretical stated principle suddenly becomes a lot more expensive to actually live up to. Schultz, as it pertains to Starbucks, had to make decisions that genuinely hurt real people in the company while continuing to publicly talk about humanity and connection. There's no way to make that contradiction not exist. Business decisions affect actual lives. Period. A turnaround story like Starbucks's can sound clean, and almost inevitably it will when it's told years later after the fact. You cut down the weak parts, you refocus towards the company, you return to growing the company, but inside the moment, those decisions don't work for everyone. They're deeply personal for the people living through them. People lose their jobs. Stores disappear from neighborhoods that relied on the economic growth from that store. A manager who worked hard to climb up the chain of Starbucks finds out that their location doesn't work anymore. Leadership in turbulent moments like that, it isn't just about choosing the correct strategy. It's about actually accepting responsibility for the human cost that strategy creates. This is also where I think that Schultz's whole idea of emotional connection gets a lot more complicated than it really seems to be. A company that asks its employees and customers to genuinely care about it is creating a deeper obligation for itself as well in return. If you frame a business as nothing more than a transaction, people will judge it on price and convenience. But if you present a business as a community or a third place, people are going to watch it closely and notice when your behavior doesn't match that promise. The stronger the emotional brand you build, the more damaging any hypocrisy underneath it becomes. And that doesn't mean that a company should avoid talking about their values altogether. It just means that values create real accountability. When you tell people that they're partners, they're going to expect to actually be treated like partners. When you call the store community, people are going to notice the exact decisions that weaken that community. The words themselves raise the standard that you're being held to, whether you meant them to or not. There's another idea running through Onward that I think is important, even though it gets repeated so often in business writing that can sound almost like a moot point. The idea that a company needs reason to exist beyond simply making money. Almost every company claims to have some kind of mission like this. I don't think any company would really publicly announce that their only purpose is to maximize revenue and crush their competitors, even when that's what their behavior really reflects day by day, which means a stated mission only actually matters the moment that it changes a realization somewhere. Starbucks saying that exists to inspire and nurture the human spirit means nothing if that sentence disappears the second it becomes inconvenient. The mission only becomes a real mission once the company is willing to give something up for it. Time, money, speed, products, a profitable store, an idea that doesn't fit the larger identity of the company. That sacrifice of something that would make the company more money or whatever proves that the principle that they said they would adhere to actually has weight behind it. Closing every store for training mattered because it costs something real. Pulling a product can matter because it gives up potential sales the company could have easily kept by just not pulling a product. Without any real trade-offs attached, stated values are just descriptions of things that the company was already planning to do anyways. And I think this connects to something we talked about with Ray Dalio a couple episodes ago, actually, which surprised me a little when I noticed it while researching this one. Dalio's whole culture at Bridgewater was built around forcing uncomfortable truths into the open area early, before they became expensive. Schultz was wrestling with a slightly different version of the same underlying problem. How do you keep the system honest with itself once the numbers alone stop being a reliable signal? Dalio solved it with radical transparency inside meetings. Schultz tried to solve it by literally shutting the entire company down for an afternoon to prove that quality still outranked speed. Different tools, but the same basic instinct underneath them. Don't let success quietly convince you that you've stopped needing it, needing to look closely at what's actually happening behind that success. Schultz also seems to understand something that connects pretty directly to Andy Grove's whole idea about strategic inflection points, even though Schultz never uses that exact language anywhere in his own writings. Grove's whole point of strategic inflection points was that the most dangerous moment for a company isn't when it's obviously failing, it's during the confusing middle stretch, when a handful of small, easy-to-dismiss signals are quietly piling up into something that could be a real problem in the future. Starbucks, during its growth years, was exactly that kind of confusing middle stretch. The espresso machines were a small signal. The breakfast sandwich smell was a small signal. The pace of new store openings is a small signal. And none of these small signals alone looked like a crisis. But together, they quietly revealed that the company was slowly drifting away from the thing that had made it work in the first place. Schultz also understood in his own way something close to what Seneca was getting at with his idea that prosperity can make people more anxious and more dependent rather than less. A company chasing growth for its own sake can end up needing that growth the way a person can end up depending on status. The growth becomes the identity, and once the growth itself becomes the goal instead of a natural result of doing something good, the company starts making decisions that protect the percent growth rate instead of protecting the thing that the number was representing in their success. I want to close on something that Schultz says, or at least implies throughout Onward, that I think is the actual heart of his entire story. A cup of coffee can be worth more in one environment than in another, because the environment itself changes what the coffee actually represents to the person drinking it. And I think that idea is true for almost everything people build, not just coffee. A shoe isn't only the material behind it. It can represent an athletic identity or taste or a belonging to a group. A phone isn't just technology. It can represent simplicity or status. A car isn't only transportation. A restaurant isn't only food. The functional product is what creates the entry point. The emotional meaning underneath it is what creates the actual attachment to the product. And to be clear, this doesn't mean that clever marketing can rescue a bad product. The coffee still has to be good enough on its own terms. The service has to actually be good. The stores have to function properly, but the functionality is the starting line, not the finish line. The strongest business, the strongest anything really, create something people would miss if it disappeared, not just notice was gone. actually miss. And that's a much higher bar to clear than just customer satisfaction. A customer can be satisfied by 100 interchangeable products in a row. Missing something means that it had carved out a real place inside that person's actual life. For years, Starbucks became a part of people's daily routines in exactly that way. The morning drink before work, the default meeting spot to study for a few hours, the stop during your long drive every single morning, the familiar storefront in an unfamiliar city that made you feel a little less out of your place. And that's the power sitting underneath the third place idea. It turns business into a part of someone's identity, part of how they move through their own life. But that kind of privilege of becoming a third space has to be maintained. And Schultz's whole story is really a warning about what happens when you stop maintaining it. The instant the business starts treating the customer like a transaction, the customer starts treating the business the same way back. And at that point, price wins, convenience wins, whatever's closest to the house wins, and the entire emotional advantage that Starbucks was built on just evaporates. So if I had to land on the one idea from all of this, it would probably come down to a question that I think applies to basically anything that you're trying to build. What's the part people would actually miss? Not whatever gets the most attention right now, not whatever happens to be the easiest thing to measure on your report somewhere. What's the actual source of attachment underneath everything else? And then there's the harder question that has to follow right behind it. Are your current systems protecting that part, or are they removing it? Maybe you're making the product faster, but a lot less thoughtful in the process. Maybe you're reaching way more people while connecting with fewer of them than before. Maybe the whole thing looks more professional, but feels less alive. The honest answer won't always be that you need to shrink back down to something smaller. That was only a solution in Starbucks' case. Sometimes growth genuinely gives an idea of resources and reach and durability it never could have had at a single store. The real answer is just to grow consciously, to understand that every single improvement you make is probably carrying some kind of hidden cost with it. Consistency can reduce personality. Speed can reduce craft. Convenience can reduce connection. More options can reduce clarity. More ambition can reduce tension in the company. But none of that means that you should just reject those things. It just means that you owe it to whatever you're building to actually see the trade-off clearly, instead of just pretending that everything is all good. And I think that's the biggest lesson sitting inside of Onward. Howard Schultz didn't come back to Starbucks because the company had forgotten how to sell coffee. He came back because it had become entirely possible to sell coffee while forgetting why any of it had mattered in the first place. And that's the danger that success creates. Failure forces you to ask what's wrong with your company immediately and without much choice in the matter. Success lets you avoid asking that question right until the problem underneath it has become impossible to avoid. Starbucks grew by turning a single cup of coffee into a ritual, turning ordinary stores for transactions into places, and by turning their employees into the face of each and every store. Then growth started pushing the company towards speed, automation, towards speed and automation instead. The turnaround that Schultz facilitated in the company required more than just a financial plan or cutting costs somewhere. It required the company remembering what kind of business that financial plan or those costs were supposed to be protecting in the first place. Because the product of Starbucks was never just coffee. It was the smell when you walk in the door, the name written on the side of your cup, the conversation with the barista across the counter, the table where you sat every day. The simple feeling that you feel when you walk in the store. And that feeling is what built Starbucks in the first place. And Schultz's hardest job in the turnaround by far was to convince an enormous fast growing company that the feelings could never be separate from the business at all. They were the business. Thanks for listening.